County Office of Education and the University of California, Riverside Civic Engagement Research Group are proud to partner with MCVA Challenge and our USD Civics to provide you a California State Seal of Civic Engagement Summer Institute. This is a two-part session, and here's part one.
We're just gonna post to a Jamboard, and we're only gonna use just the first slide on that Jamboard, where we're gonna ask you the question, what does civic learning mean to you? We're gonna take an opportunity for you guys to kind of reflect on that and answer that question, look at other people's responses, and we'll give people a few minutes to go ahead and do that. We'll talk in the main room, share either what we shared because we're so proud of it. In my case, I'll steal somebody else's work because I will like, wow, that's really amazing. And then read that out loud and be like, so I stole this from nobody because it's just on a Jamboard and there's no name attributed to it. So maybe if you want to put your name by it because someone's going to steal it and be like, this one was amazing, feel free to do that as well. But, you know, anonymity is also a beautiful thing as well. We're all in this together. And I think that you can see from these comments that civic learning is a lot. There are a lot of different things that are involved in it. And I think a lot of you are touching upon different aspects of civic learning and calling into some of it. And someone's got a one-word answer in there that I think is fantastic, potentially, depending on how we define what citizenship is. You know, I got a pretty expansive view of that and a very long definition of what I think that means. But I think that a lot of this encapsulates that. I don't know if Greg disagrees with me because I saw him shaking his head, but that might have been just somebody else in the background. All right, as those wrap up, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and share either what you shared or something that struck a chord with you, feel free to do that. Would really appreciate that.
I'm Amanda Sandoval. I teach over in Corona Norco, but I'm seeing a lot of really great things that I love. I love somebody put it with the pink sticky note. It says giving students the tools to be heard. And so I think that civic learning really is about giving students those tools. So whoever put that, I totally agree. And like understanding that their voice matters, even if they are a legal citizen, not a legal citizen, they're not of age to vote yet. So all of that stuff. And then really tying in the community and social justice work as well. So democracy being like an active sport, right? Instead of being passive in it. I like a lot of these things that people were putting on there.
Awesome. Excellent. Thanks for sharing, Amanda. Anybody else?
I appreciate that a lot of people put their own communities in that piece of learning the unique needs of the place where you come from, because everywhere is obviously different in the world. And so learning how to identify the needs within your own community as a student and building that sense of awareness that there are needs in your community that need to be met and that they can be met by you and your peers, I think is really empowering and a very cool piece of civic engagement.
Awesome, Jessica. Thank you for sharing.
I teach down in Murrieta, and it's kind of one of those areas where people don't live there for a long period of time. They live there for maybe like 4 to 6 years. There's lots of the transiency or whatever the term is for that. And I've noticed since I've been doing this with my students, it has in fact given them like an anchor and made them feel a little bit more connected to their community.
Awesome. Excellent. I said I wanted one more and Jason jumped on it. Was there anybody else that wanted to share? I certainly wanted to give those opportunities and not take those away from people.
You know, I'll share it because you kind of called me out on me shaking my head. Sorry about that. I think you made a comment about citizenship and you kind of like, well, I may agree or disagree. And I guess that's your right. But I guess what I just wanted to express, I think there's a variety of opinions and values in this group. And as the leader, I respect that. But your definition of citizenship may be different than mine or your what constitutes someone who's a member of the community or a resident or legal or in any of those things. One of the things I really try to do with my students, because I have a huge diversity of kids from all ethnic backgrounds and other sorts of diversity, is not make them feel like I know everything and I'm going to judge or whatever they're. Anyway, kind of calling you out a little bit, but just to say, we don't all have the same values, and so kind of respect that.
Sure. You know, I agree with you 100%. To me, citizenship is belonging or being a citizen of a community, whether it's a school community, whether it's the community in which you live, a citizen of this country, of this state, of this county, of this city, of this town, of the street. You're even a citizen in your own family, hopefully. And then that means the values that come with that.
Well, and citizenship actually does have a definition. A member of a family, or a family member, or a community member, or resident. Those terms all mean something, but I would say citizenship means exactly what citizenship is technically. Then other terms such as community member, stakeholder, et cetera, are appropriate terms that mean something different than citizenship.
That's fair. I agree. Reasonable people can disagree. And that's the beauty of the democracy in our country. We're going to get into that in a little bit. So thank you for pushing back, because I think it's important that we can do that in a setting to where we can have those rich conversations, because I think that they move the conversation forward, and I think they move us forward as groups and help us come to better understanding. So I really appreciate you coming out and expressing why you push back on me. I appreciate that.
Good morning, Don.
Yeah. Good morning.
I'm the one that put the word citizenship.
Okay.
I was thinking more of community. I wasn't calling out legal status.
Depends on where you were at with that kind of a conversation. And you could see the word itself was charged enough to start the conversation. And I think that that's what's important here, is that we can engage in that conversation, engage in the debate. I mean, that's what civics is all about, right? Being able to have those conversations, being able to have that voice, and being able to engage and do so in a respectful manner. So thank you for putting the word. Thank you for the pushback. Thank you for the rich conversation around it. So now we're going to get into this conversation about what is civic learning. And this is kind of a framing that our colleagues have been using over at the LEAD initiative, that civic learning is a process that enables young people to develop their civic knowledge, civic skills, and civic commitments. And it's important to note that civic learning includes preparation for both civic and political engagement. Civic engagement includes practices that seek to promote the public good through non-government organizations and the informal community work. So that idea about like seeing a need in our community, see a need, fill a need, and understanding that about our community need. And then also getting into political engagement. So that includes the activities that aim to influence state and government action through formal avenues such as voting, lobbying, and petition. Of course, there's a great deal of overlap and interdependence between civic and political engagement. And often we speak of civic engagement, we mean both intersecting forms of engagement in democracy. It's not just one, it is both of these things working together and creating that. We look at that in all the ways that we can.
Thanks, Don. One thing that I find helpful about this kind of framing that we typically use in our work, it really does call out, we not only want to support young people to kind of navigate civic and political institutions, but we also want to support them to know how to engage in community and with other community members. It's kind of a both and. And then I think the other thing that has been helpful to us and we wanted to kind of point out today is that civic learning happens in a lot of different places. So there's kind of a whole ecosystem of spaces in which young people are learning. It's not, as we know, they're not just learning, from 8 to 3 when they're at school. We do have a number of spaces, especially with civic learning, in which young people are really being able to not only gain civic knowledge, but civic skills, right? So clearly schools and classrooms and after school programs, but also community-based organizations, local and civic institutions and local government, I think are really important spaces. Families, we know that young people learn a lot, right? From families, faith-based organizations, different like networked communities, and of course, online spaces as well. So we want to recognize all of those as we're thinking about the seal, talk about a range of those spaces, especially because I think the seal brings out an opportunity to encourage schools to connect.
There are all these different places that they learn where civics has an opportunity for students to have agency. And we want to give them as much of that agency as possible so that they can do that in a productive way, as opposed to YouTube comments.
I think the other thing that we wanted to just mention as we're thinking about this kind of broad context for the seal is that clearly democracy is precarious. And this has always been true, that I think, as many of you know, John Dewey used to talk about democracy is something you have to continually support and engage in over time, that each generation has to sort of figure out the ways in which they'll support democracy. And I think we, have consistently sort of recognized that in our work, that it is a work in progress, and that we have to support young people to engage in that. It's not just about adults, it's also about any kind of member of democracy that they play a role in that. But of course, I think we can all recognize we're seeing a number of kind of concerning signs around democracy. I'm so happy that there was like an exchange earlier where people could say, I have a different viewpoint or a different idea on this. And I think that that's a wonderful and super critical critical thing for us to model for young people. We're not seeing that as much in our kind of political discourse. We see a number of sort of troubling signs in the kind of like increase in divisiveness and partisanship. We have an increase in misinformation, trust in government, trust in democracy even. I think in this context, it is particularly important to sort of think about how do we help young people make sense of this, not tell them what they should think or what sort of opinion they should have, but to help them have information to be able to kind of navigate this and deliberate with other people from their community that may have different opinions. So I think it's really kind of helpful to think about, while civic education, especially right now, may kind of be embattled in controversy, it has always been part of our public education. That much of the kind of purpose of public education was to be able to support and to engage young people to be prepared to engage in democracy. So that democratic mission of public schools has always been there. And I think with the sort of economic purposes of schools, that has lost space and time and attention. And I know many districts and even some in Riverside County are increasingly recognizing that schools are not just preparing students for college and career, but we're also preparing students for college, career, and community life or civic life. And so I think how we can think about that as teachers and educators and leaders is really important. We wanted to take a moment to kind of think about some of the civic learning experiences you had yourself that were memorable.
So did anyone want to share about their experience in the breakout room?
I spoke with Noemi and was thrilled me about just sharing her story. And I hope it's okay if I share with her Noemi, but she's a first generation American immigrant and she ran for public office. And just that transition, that we really need to be careful not to limit in some way people because of their background, to see the potential that all of our kids have. And you really never know who it might be that would actually run for office or be involved.
100%. I think that's why we're doing the good work that we're doing, right? The potential lies within all of us. And it's just a matter of who's going to help them tap into that. So there's this research that points out that there's a core set of like civic learning approaches that can make a difference. These 6 proven practices. And then this has been in the works for years, because I remember when it first came out, it was 6 promising practices, and now they're proven practices. And there's research behind it that talks about what those 6 proven practices are in terms of making a difference, which is those first 2 thought bubbles that we'll call them. So this is outlined in the Civic Missions and Schools report, the 6 proven practices. It's also embedded in the 6 proven practices report. There's a ton of research about it. And then it's also important to note that in order to strengthen civic learning and ensure that it's responsive and inclusive to young people in our communities and our society, we need to expand the notion of what civic education entails. And so we've got these expansion packs over here. Those expansion packs are prioritizing that equity in our lived experiences, civic media literacy, social emotional learning, school climate reform, and action civics. Like all of those things help to contribute to our students being able to engage actively and civically. We just wanted to hammer home those points. So we got the 6 proven practices, we've got these expansion packs, and it's important that we provide opportunity for our people to have that time and the commitment to engage in that work. All of this comes out in a report that was put together by Levine, Kawashima, and Ginsberg. And then we get into the benefits of civic learning. There's a strong evidence that high quality civic learning opportunities in school can encourage more youth to embrace a set of civic commitments as a young adults. For example, to volunteer, to follow the news, or participate in their community problem-solving activities and participate in electoral politics. So there's a huge benefit. There's a huge windfall. I feel like based off of our conversations and our chats, jam boards, that I'm really preaching to the choir here. But it's important that as we get into this work, that you're not always going to be preaching to the choir. And so that we have this research and this information to help back us up and support us in the conversations that we have with our colleagues as we hope to change what it is that we're doing and as we promote our civic engagement and our state seal of civic engagement.
We want to bring up 2 other things. The other thing we wanted to really mention, and this may be quite clear, as Don said, we are definitely speaking to the choir here, but this may be quite clear to people. We do also see in the research that youth have very insufficient opportunities in schools. So there's a real lack of civic learning. I think that's no surprise to anyone, but we do want you to know there's some evidence to back that up. This was actually a study that our team focused in California California. We were surveying young people and we found that there were quite low rates of doing things like service learning in high school or participating in a simulation or even being in classes where a wide range of views or perspectives were discussed. So we saw pretty low percentages around that. We did see that 68% of students learned a lot about the structure and function of government. So that clearly is like a little bit higher. We should be proud of that, except that this survey was actually given to 12th grade government students. And so the fact that it was only 68% is concerning for a whole other reason, right? Is that they were in a government course and didn't really feel like they learned about the structure and function of government. So I think that this study for us really has pointed to that, we have to really think about not only how to increase the number of opportunities that students have over time, and not just in history, social science too, to civic learning, but that we also want to make sure that we're thinking about the quality as well. And there's another study that we did recently to look at to what extent are their kind of civic goals being incorporated into LCAP plans, so the local control accountability plans. And as all of you know well, those plans really are the core place where districts are articulating their goals. These are the kinds of things that not only are we going to work on, but that we are going to invest in through budgetary funds. And we found a very small percentage, this was just a year ago that we did this, where we looked at all of the LCAP plans for the whole state of California. And we found a very low percentage had anything related to the term civic or citizenship and democracy was even lower than that. And we found a similar kind of pattern that it was very low for more kind of like programmatic mentions of things like service learning or student government or that. I think what this told us was that there's also not a commitment to civic learning in these sort of broad aims. There is a way for us to think about not only how to integrate it into the curriculum in the classroom, but also into the articulated goals of a district to say, we care about this, this is important. And we know that that then supports everyone in the system, from principals and school leaders to teachers as well. Hopefully this is, as you're thinking about the seal, that we're not just thinking about how do we use the opportunities that we already have. And I think that that is important. We want to build off of what we already have. But I think we also want to think together over these sessions about how can we also expand and further make sure that there are opportunities that are accessible to all students.
These potential pitfalls that we want to avoid. And I'll share a quick story about how this can all kind of interact with each other. So access pitfalls is typically, if you're the AP Gov teacher at your class, and then you're going to be giving that out to your AP Gov students, and then those kids in AP Gov are going to be the only ones going to get that opportunity or that access of equity. Or clubs that only meet after school, or GPA cutoffs. Those things are all things that can kind of limit access to our students. And quality is like unimodal, only covers historical events or not action oriented, or we only have these two opportunities for you. You can either volunteer at the animal shelter, or you can volunteer after school. And then we've got approach, which is not reflective of students' cultural experiences or students not involved in the decision-making process, excludes them from having that agency that civic learning is really all about promoting. And then support by either having like a complicated application process or no system for progress monitoring, not an opportunity for students to check in or what to do if they hit roadblocks in their civic journey. An example, not to diss on the community that I live in, but I live in the town of Upland. We have a homeless population issue in Upland where we've got quite a few homeless people. And the city of Upland, in their infinite wisdom, decided that the best way to handle our homeless population was to erect signs that said, please do not feed the panhandlers. If that is our approach to how we handle civic issues within our community, and the civic opportunity that we present at the local high school is like, oh, you can make the signs, that approach doesn't allow equitable access or doesn't allow for people to get into a rich conversation about what are the key causes of that. What are the things that are causing homelessness in our community? And maybe we should erect a food shelter or maybe get into those kinds of issues. So we want to make sure that we're looking at a totality of the picture and that we try to avoid these pitfalls. And that's what Erica and I are going to be here to do as you guys go through this journey together. So the access to civic learning opportunities, if you come from a high SES or socioeconomic status compared to an average SES, you're 2 times more likely to discuss how laws are made, almost 2 times more likely to report participating in service learning activities, and you're just more likely to engage in a debate or a panel discussion, which is crazy. There's access issues within our schools right now. And so we're hoping to look at that and try to curve that. Now, this study that we're looking at the results from took a look at ninth graders. If we're continuing to limit that, we want to open that up as much as humanly possible. Now, the NAEP, this study was done by colleagues at Circle, shows that 12th graders' scores on the NAEP, which is the National Assessment for Educational Progress, it's like the nation's report card, back in 2012, showed inequities based on parent education levels when it came to student access to civic learning practices, such as discussing political events, all of those things. And then these other studies have found that high achieving students and white students from higher SES backgrounds often get more exposure to civic learning opportunities like service learning and other controversial issue discussions. We don't give our students the tools in our lower SES areas to engage in those conversations. And so we just shy away from them altogether. My kids can't engage in that. I know that I'm with educators who are here on a Saturday, and you're probably like holding your hand to your head because you can't stand when people say that. I'm in the same boat as you. But it leads, this inequitable distribution of civic learning has a number of huge implications, including who feels prepared and empowered to participate in our democracy. And that's evidenced in who we have participating in our democracy. And so we're working to go ahead and change that.
And we also wanted to share a little bit of some of this national data, is obviously hoping to give you some context, but also some evidence to think about the ways in which you want to integrate it locally. So we also wanted to share some local data really quickly, and then we're going to look at some scenarios, some fictional scenarios around how some schools went about integrating the seal, and then we can kind of dig in together to think about what would really increase access and equity. In this study of the Inland Empire specifically, you can see that there's low numbers in terms of different forms of engagement. So you've got some examples here of like discussing politics with family and friends, attending a public meeting, or contacting or visiting a public official. Unfortunately, we see that the region still faces some disparities in terms of participation, and we also see that in representation as well in the Inland Empire. And that it still does lag behind when you look at it in comparison to the rest of Southern California, as well as the state itself. So you can see this not only by race and ethnicity, but also by age. But I think the promising and exciting thing to share is that we are seeing some really promising indicators of progress. So we are really seeing that young people, and this is showing sort of gains in youth voting. So you'll see where you have the red, the dark red, or even the kind of orange color, that there was, you can see the percentages here, an incredibly large and significant change in voting from 2014 to 2018 among just 18 to 24-year-olds. You know, we're having some really exciting sort of increases in young people participating in voting. And we also see this in other forms of youth participation in democracy. So I think that there is a lot of progress in the Inland Empire, and we also see this nationally as well. So I think that's really exciting. And we have seen in the state as well, and a number of organizations where young people, and student-led organizations where young people are really saying, we want more of this kind of learning and this kind of discussion in our schools and in our classrooms. We had a wonderful organization called Generation Up that advocated for the seal. They visited the state board, they wrote letters, they made a video, they said, we want to be recognized for the civic engagement. We want to encourage our peers to do more of this, and our teachers and educators. So it's also an exciting moment for this work. So we want to dig in together to some vignettes. We're going to break you off into small groups, and you'll look, there's a Padlet, and we'll look at the Padlet for cohort 1. And there's 3 scenarios. We wanted to give you a chance to kind of dig into, and again, these are not real schools, it's sort of a fictional scenario, but we thought it was really helpful to kind of think, okay, what would it mean in very concrete terms to go about doing this if we were thinking about equity and equality and access? What would that mean, and how would we go about doing that? So we would love for you to look at the vignettes and then add some comments, talk with your group and add some comments about what are the ways in which that school or district you think are supporting equity and equality in terms of the seal, and where might they be constraining it, or what are kind of hurdles or barriers that might be put up that they could think about or could consider. So there's no right or wrong answer. It's just that this is complicated and it's hard when you really think about how do we do this on the ground. So we'll go ahead and break you into groups. If you don't get through all 3, that's fine, but at least try to look at 2, identify the ones that seem most interesting to you and kind of dig into those there. As you come back in, remember to mute, but we are going to discuss. So we do want people to also feel comfortable to unmute and share. We heard some awesome, Dawn and I tried to jump between breakout groups and we saw some really awesome, deep discussions. So hopefully these fictional vignettes brought up some tensions and some real challenges to think about when you think about this in reality and in operationalizing it. So we're going to take a couple minutes on each one. So we'll spend a few minutes on vignette 1, and we would love to hear thoughts that came up for people. So if you want to take a look at what some other folks wrote, but if you didn't have a chance to add to the Padlet, that's also fine. We'd love to hear what are some things that you thought in that scenario were supporting equity and equality, and maybe some things that were constraining it. So we've got Hamilton High School in vignette 1. Any thoughts?
Yeah, we're in room 3. And we were talking about, that, it's great that, the kids had an opportunity to get some tutoring during lunch and after school. However, can kids stay after school because of family commitments? And also, it would be cool to go to something, but if they had a bunch of people rush to one place, it might overwhelm the organization. At the same time, it's not mentioned there, how did the kids get there? Everyone might not have a right to get there. Are they taking a van from the school to go there to do those hours? So those are some of the constraints as well. But at the same time, it was a great idea to open up the eyes of young people, see how others live and how they need help and so forth. But is it going to be accessed or give true access to everyone involved?
We were going to add to his thoughts. It is a great option, but it's the only option. So it totally takes student decision out of it. And some students might not have a heart to serve the homeless or the aging population. They might have another idea. So it eliminates that. And we were also concerned about the 5-page paper, which might be super overwhelming for our EL population. And they might not even try just because of that.
Yeah, we discussed that 5-page paper and thought it would be best to do more of an interactive presentation, which will display more of their experience rather than copy and paste on a 5-page essay.
Thank you. Yeah. And I'm seeing in the chat some other question of RJ Circle. Ernesto, do you mind sharing a little bit more?
Yeah, so pretty much restorative justice circles are mostly when you're trying to, restore justice, but I feel that that's also a good opportunity for sometimes for people to vent and talk about issues that might be affecting them. And I just felt that this would be a good activity that you can do after volunteering to share out what you learned so that other people can hear your experience and also develop from that as well too. I had something very similar to this in high school. I went to a private Catholic high school, Modern Day, and we had to have community service hours as well too. And so I got involved with the program called RAD Camp, Rising Above Disabilities. And I've been doing that camp since, just because that experience had a very profound meaning in my life. And so I still do it now. And so I learned a lot from that, from that experience. So I thought it would be something great to do that. But the 5-page paper, as they were talking about it, it'd be something very difficult for them to do. And I thought maybe just having a circle, we could just talk about the experiences and people kind of come together and learn from each other would be pretty great.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. It's exciting to hear of something you did as a young person that you're still doing. And I think that we sometimes forget the kind of like impact that these types of experiences can really have on young people. And I love what people are saying about not only is it important to have choice where students can choose things that they are passionate about or drawn to or connected to, but also different pathways so that they have a range of flexibility and ways to engage depending on what's actually doable for them. Any last thoughts about vignette 1?
I'd like to share just what we kind of talked about in our group. I don't remember what number we were, but just the idea that I think sometimes what we do when it comes to like this civic piece is I think we forget like why we're doing what we're doing. And so I think we don't make the connection strongly enough to like, why is it important in a democracy to have people who are civically engaged? What is homelessness and kind of why is it a wicked problem? And how do we define it so differently and how then do we solve it? And, having those discussions is to be civically minded. And so it's not just about going to a shelter and then writing about it, but it's that idea of being kind of collaborative and kind of leading up to this and then reflecting on it, and why James Banks from University of Washington always talks about how to know, to care, and to act. And it's that I think that we miss those pieces for kids. I think that we don't necessarily talk a lot about, do we have an obligation to participate in public life? Should there be a requirement for us to volunteer? Kind of having those discussions, like, why should we care? If we don't, then who will? Those types of things. I think that those are such powerful conversations to have, in addition to like bringing in cans and going to this shelter. I think we kind of miss out on a little bit on why we're doing that. So that was just some things we talked about.
Yeah, and just to kind of piggyback on what Courtney's talking about, I think too, and that was my issue with this one was, okay, they're trying, which is always great, at least we're thinking about how we do something, but it didn't really show us even where the supports were within a class or within the school, like, because to just throw things at kids like, all right, we're going to go volunteer and you have to go either to, the limit of what they could choose to do, but then also where's the support for it? Because I think for this to truly work, you have to have someone like, and I'm fortunate because I'm at a small school, so I'm able to do it through my class. So my class is the place where all my students, every student at my school does this, right? So, but when you're at a big school, if you don't have that, some people who are truly invested in it and saying, this matters, and it's something that's going to be kind of a key point of our entire year in a class with lots of support, then it's really challenging because, and that's where you lose kids too, right? Because you're going to have, some kids are going to have parents who care. Like we talked about that in our group, and those parents are already like doing these types of things, and it's kind of part of their upbringing. Other kids, no one's talking about it. And then you begin to lose kids if you don't have those supports in place. And like Courtney says, it's like, there's so much front loading with all of it. Like, why do we do what we do? How do you find what you're passionate about? What is your why? And how would you express what you learned? And can you work with other people, or do you work alone? Or how long do you take the time? Or does it become a lifelong passion like Ernesto's talking about? But that takes lots of supports from multiple people, and some people who really are a whole school being invested in it, basically. I mean, if you really want it to work, I would say. And that's where I thought with this one, like, some great ideas, but there were so many questions I had, like, well, how is that? And the test, I mean, that's overwhelming for kids too, right? Like, I got to take a citizenship test. Like, what's that test? That's going to limit kids too. So I just think it takes a lot of thought and time to really put something really powerful and meaningful together, like with what Courtney was saying and some other people.
Yeah. Thank you both. I really appreciate what you're saying about, like, you have to start somewhere. I think having some steps and pieces in place is really important. But I think part of what we'll do over several sessions, but we'll start in a little bit with your district team, is to really think about not only who else is part of this and can be part of our team, because we don't want this to certainly rest on any one person's shoulders, but also how do we think about this over time? So what are the things that we can put in place next year, maybe the year after, and in 3 years? Because certainly everyone's juggling a ton, but how do we work towards that aim, which is that students are getting these opportunities in multiple classes and not just in 12th grade, right? So they are able to sort of explore issues that they care about. They're able to sort of think about, what way do I want to participate in my community and my society? There's some great questions in the chat around the citizenship test. And I think this was another thing we really wanted to put in this vignette, to sort of lift up and say, like, is the citizenship test a barrier? And also, what does it mean? Much of what's assessed, I guess you could say, on that citizenship, is that really connected to the curriculum? And what does that mean to expect students to fulfill that? And so I'm curious if anyone wants to share anything, and I'm seeing a bunch of interesting points in the chat as well.
I was going to comment on it, not because I said something about it earlier, but if it's presented as an opportunity to teach about citizenship and that sort of thing, yes, I wouldn't put that in the description of the program, because I think you're right that a test would scare some students away, especially immigrant students might look at that and be like, gosh, I don't even know, my parents aren't citizens. So I wouldn't put that in there in the description, but I think having that as part of the curriculum or whatever isn't a bad thing. But to put the test, I think you would say, is more of a barrier, more of a wall than a bridge.
I appreciate what you said about that, Greg. I'm kind of thinking it as a little bit differently because I have found that when I am faced with taking a test, it works for me because it gives me a guideline to build my knowledge on. My nieces are dual citizens between the US and Denmark. And I know that when my sister-in-law was studying to be a US citizen, she knows more about US history than I do. She knows more about the Constitution than I do. And I really respect that. And her daughters saw that and they wanted to go ahead and get their dual citizenship and become citizens in Denmark. So they were on a rigorous test taking program to become dual citizens there. So I think it can become, I think it's within the context and how it's presented. And so I think some students will flourish on it and other students would be more hesitant. Like you said, it could become a barrier, but I think there's multiple sides and multiple ways of looking at it.
I want to just raise, and we'll get into this as we think about the criteria, but I know that many districts across the state are really struggling with how do we think about criteria 2, which really focuses on civic knowledge and what is the way that students can demonstrate that. And I just want to lift up a number of the concerns about the citizenship test in the chat. And I think districts will have to think about really what makes sense. But I also think some of the other things that people have raised is like, what is the kind of civic knowledge that we really do want students to demonstrate? Is that reflected on the citizenship? Are there curricular pieces in place to support them to learn that knowledge? And then I think the other piece is, do students have other ways to demonstrate it? If the citizenship test is not going to be the way in which they can demonstrate their knowledge best, what are their other options and the other ways that they may be supported to do so? So I think that'll be something that districts will have to really wrestle with in that piece. I want to give space for any other thoughts around that, and then we'll move to the other vignettes.
If there is an inclusion of the citizenship test, it should be part of government, not a part of civic service.
Right.
Could you hear me?
Yeah, I was going to say, Floydale, your sound is a little tricky to hear, but I think we heard that you're saying that it's separate from the service or the action that students would be taking. Is that right? No, I think we're losing your sound, but maybe you could put it in the chat. I think I'm seeing in the chat some pieces about like how we think about
part of the government class course.
I see what you're saying. So that some kind of assessment like that.
Does this count?
No.
We're having a lot of trouble hearing you. I'm so sorry. But I think your point is like, if we're thinking about that assessment, then it's part of a course and it should be tied to the curriculum that you're going to be supporting students to learn, and that might be separate from the civic engagement or the action. But I also think we want to think about how knowledge and action go together and the ways in which we do want to build. I think to some extent, I heard some people mentioning earlier this kind of cycle of developing questions, engaging those questions and investigating civic issues, and then engaging in dialogue, right? Building knowledge around it and then taking action. And I'm seeing some questions in the chat about the seal, that the seal, is the seal for a school or is it for the individual students? And so we'll get into some of these questions with Sarah, but individual students earn the seal, but the district itself has to adopt the seal in order to then have schools and students be able to earn that. We actually only have about 2 more minutes to discuss this. So I want to see if anyone has anything that they want to bring up about vignette 2 or 3.
So I don't remember which vignette it was, but it was the one that was talking about, I think it was 2, the one that had access through the AP teacher and things like that. As a person that in high school, I did academic decathlon. I had all the AP teachers helping us for that kind of stuff. It was not inclusive whatsoever. People were scared to even walk in the door. And that is something that I would totally worry about with number 2. Yes, there are great support structures. Yes, there are awesome qualified people. But as soon as a general ed student hears that the AP teacher is in charge of something, they immediately don't want anything to do with it.
I wanted to add to Jason's too. Anytime there's a GPA requirement, I sort of shudder at it because having a heart for service or serving our community has nothing to do with academic GPAs.
Yeah, and I wanted to add to it as well. As educators, we're always looking to turn kids on to an education. If we put a limit on a GPA that they had to have, but we're taking that foundation away from the kids, because that could be something to really interest the kid and take a foundation into not only improve his or her life, but improve his or her community.
Thank you all. And I'm seeing in the chat too, a lot of people saying that Vignette 2 is not inclusive, but exclusive, and that it has all barriers and very elitist, that the kinds of those structures in place are not going to allow the kind of intention of access and equity for students. So I think the other thing I wanted to just give a moment for is Vignette 3, which I know brought up some really important conversations in a number of different breakout groups. Any thoughts that people want to share that you're grappling with around Vignette 3?
3, I actually did the reading. And 3 kind of stuck out to me as, did that fit within the civil disobedience possibility? Okay, so I was thinking that was actually, I mean, as far as everything that they had planned and how it went, being able to show the students that there are going to be barriers put forward, I think is just as important as showing them like, hey, if you try, everything works. Because you got to show them like, hey, if you try something and somebody puts some red tape in front of you, then how do we handle this? How do we talk about it? So I thought that was something that was actually a positive from that, is that it can show the students, you can have a really solid discourse about, what is it that makes that the way that things are right now, and how do we move forward?
Thank you, Brian. Other folks?
And I would want to find out, if I was an advisor to this group, there's all kinds of questions that would pop up to me as an advisor. And I would want to lead like a brainstorming session for the students about what are their legal and constitutional rights, what are their rights within the framework of school hours, and what it would take, for participation, what kind of follow-up would best suit the occasion. And I would really want to lead a brainstorming session about it rather than just going into it blindly. But they should know their legal rights. And if they are at a protest, it's important for protesters to know what their legal rights are.
Thank you all.
I think one of the things that really, well, there's a lot that really bothers me about Vignette 3, but it starts with them saying that the students worked with the community to try and make this protest happen. And then we're told that they were affiliating with a violent group. And so instead of finding a way to support the students to, like, we've had protests at our school where our admin has come in and said, you can only do it if it fits within these structures, which did create barriers for the students, but still made space for them to protest. And so here, this really feels like it's the district just shutting down students' opportunity to have a voice and share out, and villainizing them for becoming a part of a political group. And I think that's really dangerous and something we want to avoid.
Thank you. I really appreciate you lifting that up. And I think that how we often talk about student voice and choice, and then when students raise those voices and those choices, we as adults need to be ready to listen and to process that and to navigate and model discussion and deliberation with them and the ways in which we're hoping that they will do that in the world. And so I think this is a really great example, pushes at that in a way that I think is really problematic. And I do, not that anyone has a lot of free time, but I do encourage you in your free time to look at the criteria, especially around the taking informed action one, because actually the State Board of Education had a very, I think, productive conversation about civil disobedience and having that recognized and supported as part of the seal, and that students that are doing things that can be considered civic engagement and civic action, they can be recognized as part of the seal, and they don't need to happen under school hours necessarily always, right? Then this was kind of what we had looked at earlier in the civic ecosystem, that young people are engaging in their communities in important ways at all times. And so I think for schools to think about, how do we create a space for students to reflect and demonstrate that and share that as part of our school hours through the seal, but it doesn't necessarily mean the action has to happen in school hours and through a school activity per se. So I think that the seal will bring up some really wonderful opportunities for communities and schools to think together about the different ways in which students are engaging around issues that matter to them. So
I just wanted to add to Brian's thoughts, because it made me think a different way, is that the students start with one action. They want to do a protest and then they're shut down. But maybe that's a huge opportunity for them then to go speak at the school board and communicate their thoughts and really educate other adults on what they wanted to do. And so the seal, I think, has tremendous flexibility. And it just goes to show you that what you thought you might be doing, maybe it turns into another activity that's just as valuable.
Thank you. I really appreciate you highlighting that again. I think that's a good note to end on. I'm going to share my screen, and I hope that you will continue these conversations we're just going to take one more minute to kind of think about this one resource that I'd also recommend. And maybe Don, if you don't mind putting the link to the chat to this report. This is a report that actually Joe Kahn, who's in the other cohort, and also our colleagues Kathy Cohen from Chicago and Jessica Marshall, wrote about this framing of lived civics and trying to really think about how in civic learning, and this is, I think, connects to when we think about equitable approaches, how do we really drawing on not only the issues that matter to students, but the lived experiences of our students, and particularly young people of color. And classrooms can really be a space to recognize young people's expertise. Young people live in community and society. They have a number of different experiences with civic institutions, with local government, and to be able to not only recognize their expertise, but also recognize that oftentimes those institutions don't treat people fairly. And so how do we recognize that when we are teaching about civic learning and civic education, that how do we really wrestle with the questions around our democracy? Our democracy is imperfect, and it means that we all have to wrestle with that together to think about, again, how to renew that with each generation. I think it's really important for us to sort of think about how do we navigate those kinds of conversations and set them up in ways that can be respectful and also productive, but not shying away from the real questions that I think are before all of us and our young people. There's in this report, and if folks are interested, we encourage you to take a look. I think there's a number of different approaches that we thought we wanted to lift up in particular. And one of those is really emphasizing the theories and practices that are rooted and responsive to the lived realities of young people. So really understanding, and again, many people brought this up when we talked about what does civic learning mean, really understanding the lived reality of the young people in the community where you work, and in particular through a lens of equity and specifically race and ethnicity, but other forms of equity and inclusion, and really thinking about how does that impact the young people in my classroom and in my school, and what are the ways in which I can also understand my own identity and how that impacts me and my position, and maybe even the experiences that I bring as well. But also really promoting structures and learning experiences that are co-constructed with young people. So how can we maybe think about, if we are doing a civic engagement project together, how can we co-construct that with our students? How can we really listen to and bring up these discussions around the things that they're interested in and really hear from them and allow that space for their agency and expertise and voices? And I think, again, as we talked about, the other thing that's highlighted here is just engaging young people in discussions and interrogation of politics and the state and power, and really understanding the dynamics of power and also the kind of power that young people and individuals hold, right? And what does it mean to really participate and to be able to create change within your community? What does that look like, and what are the ways in which you can go about doing that? Thinking about also exposing the differences, right, and access and power, so that we are really helping young people understand the ways in which, if you are taking action and you are thinking about the power that you do have, where might there be barriers, and what kinds of barriers have you maybe experienced before? And in particular, recognizing that different groups of students, but also different groups in our society, experience that kind of power and access in different ways. And so how do we recognize that when we are thinking about participating in civic life? We have to recognize those things, and we have to help and support young people to make sense of that, and to also navigate that in ways that they can change that and really still have a voice and have some impact. We want to think about all of these. So I want to kind of tie together a little bit this piece. We talked earlier this morning about just what does civic learning mean in general. We know it happens in a range of different spaces. And we also thought a little bit about what we know is that it's infrequent, and we also know it's inequitable. And then we've also talked about some ways in which, as you think about implementing the seal specifically, if we do really want to think about access and equity, how do we do that operationally? How do we make sure that we're not creating structures that might end up being barriers for students, right? How can we open up a number of options and choices and a number of pathways for students to really have these kinds of experiences. I'm really excited to introduce Sarah Smith, who is the history social science consultant with the California Department of Ed. Sarah has been instrumental in rolling out the seal. She has had a massive job doing this new program and in the midst of COVID and sending out insignias and seals. And we are so grateful for your time to come on a Saturday morning to talk with us. So if you are just coming back in, if you can mute yourself, that would be great. We will have some time at the end for Q&A. And if you have questions or thoughts, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll also be watching the chat as we go through this. But we do want to give Sarah some time she graciously agreed to join us to talk about an overview of the seal, as well as the student eligibility and a number of the kind of technical aspects and the support from CDE that you'll have. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Sarah, and thank you again, Sarah, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Erica, for having me. I'm really glad to be here. And as you may have seen, I just dumped a whole lot of links in the chat. So I will be mentioning each and every one of these as we go through the presentation, but I wanted you to have them there in case you wanted to do some perusing of your own. And I'm also going to share my screen briefly. I can't see the chat as I'm talking, so I'm just going to keep going, and I'm going to count on someone to interrupt me if anything's going awry or there's any big questions. And again, thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here with this group. As Erica mentioned, I am a consultant with the CDE, and my primary task has been supporting the State Seal of Civic Engagement over the past year and a half or so. Before joining the CDE, I did teach high school history social science, primarily in Fairfield and then in Elk Grove. I'm mostly US history, economics, but I really did a little bit of everything. And I will be talking about the State Seal. I'll give a general overview. We'll talk briefly about the criteria, student eligibility, and then I'll spend some time going over the resources that we have to offer. So I want to start briefly with just a general overview of the State Seal. It is a formal recognition conferred by the State Superintendent for students in grades 11 or 12. And those students have demonstrated excellence in civics education and participation, which includes an understanding of the US Constitution, the California Constitution, and democratic systems of government. And so those 5 criteria adopted by the state board back in September of 2020 are meant to provide kind of like a framework for LEAs who are making determinations of student qualifications at the local level. So what this means is we have this statewide framework, but the opportunity really will look different in each LEA that chooses to adopt it, depending on the community and the context and all that stuff. And so regardless of the differences in local implementation, the one thing I want to highlight before we move much further is that the criteria are written to ensure that all students have the opportunity for the State Seal. So regardless of their school settings, unique or unconventional expressions of civic engagement, they all have this opportunity to work towards a State Seal of Civic Engagement. And just to start off with a little bit of an update on the insignias that we have sent out so far, this is our first year of offering insignias, and we began mailing them out on April 1st. And we are at, as of yesterday, 5,359 insignias requested statewide. The vast majority are going on diplomas, 89.5%, transcripts about 10.5%. And then we had a smattering of insignias that are going to go on GED certificates and certificates of completion, which is pretty exciting. And then geographically, I do want to mention that Southern California, basically about 74% of the insignias we have sent out have gone to Southern California. So nice job, excellent work. And I do understand that you have already spent some time discussing this, the meaning of civics, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide. I do want to highlight 2 specific resources from the History Social Science Framework, though, that sometimes people aren't sure are there. There is the Appendix E, which explores civic education, and then Appendix H, which focuses on service learning and civic engagement in general. So if anyone has questions about these, I'm happy to talk more about them later if there's time. And then I want to give some background about the State Seal of Civic Engagement as well. So this opportunity dates back to 2017 with Assembly Bill 24. And that basically instructed the CDE to develop a set of statewide criteria to award students who have demonstrated excellence in civic education. I'll read just a little bit from the Ed Code to highlight the intent of the legislature when they drafted this opportunity. So they were really looking at establishing this seal as a way to encourage and to create pathways for pupils in both elementary and secondary schools to become civically engaged in democratic governmental institutions at all levels, at the local, state, and national level. And the Ed Code further basically tasked the state superintendent and the CDE to work with stakeholders to develop these criteria that the state board then adopted. And the thinking was that that criteria would be a framework for LEAs to implement programming locally if they chose to offer the state seal. And I want to highlight a couple of additional special considerations that are included in the Ed Code. The first, and I've mentioned already, is accessibility. And that is really one of the highlights of this opportunity. This means that the state seal should be accessible to students regardless of their school community. So if they are in continuation schools, juvenile justice programs, traditional public schools, independent charters, regardless of their income, it should be available to special education students, English learners, and any other underrepresented students. It's key to include all of those student groups in plans for awarding the state seal. Also, there's this real importance of depth and civic engagement. So looking at how do we encourage real, authentic, long-term civic engagement. So looking at how can LEAs involve elementary and middle schools in their efforts. Even though elementary and middle school students can't earn a state seal, there still could be maybe local intermediate awards, perhaps a seal that is earned upon promotion from 8th grade to 9th grade that could encourage those students to get started at a very young age and then earn the state seal in grade 11 or 12. And then finally, looking at how to encourage interdisciplinary collaboration. So the goal is that the state seal is not just the purview of the history of social science classroom or the government teacher, but rather that it really transcends all the different courses that could be available at school. So looking at considerations of maybe how do we involve science, maybe through environmental literacy or visual and performing arts, world languages, career technical education, but just that the opportunity really brings in all of those different curricular realms. And we're also encouraging that LEAs consider incorporating SEL connections into their state seal programming as well. The state board discussed these at length when they heard the state seal of civic engagement criteria, and I'll share some links. If you would like some viewing later on, you can watch the state board discussions at your leisure. So I do understand that you have all read through the criteria, but I want to go through it just really quickly so we're all on the same page. These are the 5 criteria that were adopted by the State Board of Education 3 years after the legislation was signed into law. So the first criteria is that the student must be engaged in academic work in a productive way. You'll notice that leaves a lot of flexibility in terms of what that looks like, but the student must be at least enrolled in school and attending classes, participating in classes. The second criteria is that the student must demonstrate a competent understanding of United States and California constitutions, functions and governance of local governments, tribal government structures and organizations, the role of the citizen in a constitutional democracy, and democratic principles, concepts, and processes. And we do have some of our stakeholder groups that are developing modules that can help students get to that knowledge of tribal governments as well as local governments, just in case that is something a student would not get to until grade 12 in a traditional public school. I'll talk more about those towards the end. And then continuing on, the third criteria is that the student must participate in one or more informed civic engagement projects that address real-world problems and require students to identify and inquire into civic needs or problems, consider varied responses, take action, and reflect on efforts. So this is really that criteria for the civic engagement project or projects. The fourth requirement is that the student must demonstrate civic knowledge, skills, and dispositions through self-reflection. So some type of reflection completed by the student at the end of these projects, what they've learned, the experiences they had, etc. And then number 5, the student must exhibit character traits that reflect civic mindedness and a commitment to positively impact the classroom, school, community, and/or society. So this is really looking at how does the student, what's the evidence that the student has these civic-minded qualities, that they are committed to this positive change. And we've seen these mostly come in the forms of letters of recommendation, at least this past year. So talking a little bit about who is eligible to earn the state seal of civic engagement, and it is really any pupil who's enrolled in California public schools, direct funded charter schools, the juvenile justice system, and or alternative school settings in grades 11 or 12. So the student must be at least in grade 11 to earn that state seal. And I should also mention that the LEA must have adopted programming to award student with a state seal before the students can actually request that state seal of civic engagement. Now, I did mention that LEAs may develop local means of recognition for younger students as a pathway to earning the state seal. And we are hearing of some LEAs, I think I mentioned, developing promotion awards for 8th grade to 9th grade. And the insignia can go on a variety of documents, as you saw earlier. The majority are going on diplomas. They can also go on grade 11 or 12 transcript, GED certificates, or certificates of completion. I should mention there is no charge for the insignias. You will not be asked to pay any money when you are requesting your insignias. I do want to highlight, if you're familiar with the State Seal of Biliteracy, this is somewhat similar to the State Seal of Biliteracy in the sense that the insignia will go on either the diploma or the transcript or the certificate. The Golden State Merit Seal diploma, I understand, automatically is affixed to both the transcript and the diploma. So just a couple of small differences there. So now I want to talk about developing local programming. I think many of you are wondering, how do we bring this to our LEA, to our school, and what does that kind of look like? So essentially, to adopt programming, it must come from the county or the district or the independent charter, and those whose populations include students in grade 11 or 12. These are the ones that can adopt the formal programming to award the State Seal of Civic Engagement. So as a classroom educator, if you're interested in bringing this to your site, it would be a matter of working with the district or the county, unless you're an independent charter, to really adopt and develop that programming. One question we've gotten a lot is, we are developing this program, we have our criteria, do we need to turn it into the CDE for approval? And you do not. The CDE does not review local state seal programming. You don't need to tell the CDE or ask for permission. Basically what happens is, when you complete the insignia request form, you sign it at the end, you are self-certifying that your local programming is in line with the statewide criteria, that students are fulfilling these basic requirements that all kind of align with that statewide criteria. And I also understand that the group has already talked through some of these steps for developing local programming, so I won't spend too much time on this slide. I just want to emphasize one thing I've been hearing from the field quite a bit is the importance of forming teams, forming local implementation teams to really work towards this programming. So ideally that would look like including representatives from the district or the county, if you're doing a county-wide program, site-based administrative leadership, teachers, of course, students. We've also seen a lot of counselors being involved in local programming, which is great. And if you can get any community members or maybe even parents involved in this team to help with this process, that seems to be working very well. And that would be the team that then develops the board resolution, develops and adopts any local criteria, if you're doing any local criteria in addition to the statewide criteria, and then doing the tough work of designing the actual programming components, the requirements, the pathways, the applications, the record keeping procedures. And then finally, the fun part, the requesting insignias from the CDE and distributing them to students. So what resources are available? That's what I will finish with, going over all the different resources from the CDE that we have for you. And I want to start with the State Seal of Civic Engagement webpage. I'm sure many of you have seen. This is where I would start. And we're actually turning in, I've submitted an update to this page that will include a few more resources to really help local implementation. And we're looking forward to that being published in the next couple of weeks. But I want to highlight the Procedures and Forms tab. So we have two PowerPoints there. One is an overview, and then one is local programming. So one is, much more general for people who maybe don't know much about the State Seal, and then local programming for those who are trying to implement it locally. And you're welcome to download these, use these at your site, steal the slides, do whatever you need. You can also access the insignia request form from this webpage, and also our frequently asked questions webpage, which I'll talk about in a moment. I am not going to spend too much time on this slide either, but I want to give you just a taste of what's available in our local programming PowerPoint. So what we've done in that PowerPoint is we've broken down the criteria and included key considerations and questions for each criteria to help you work through what this looks like locally. So for example, for criteria number 1, being engaged in academic work in a productive way, what does that look like for you locally? What does it mean for a student to be academically engaged in a productive way? For criteria 2, summarized quite a bit as demonstrate a competent understanding of key curriculum, some questions might be, so what coursework is going to be required or recommended? What about the role of grades? Will they be required? What about including courses outside of history, social science, the role of assessments, etc.? And so we have these questions and considerations broken down for each of the additional criteria. One often overlooked webpage that I'm really trying to highlight is the implementation guidance. So when the State Board of Education adopted the criteria back in September, they also adopted implementation guidance, which is guidance to help LEAs implement the State Seal locally. So we have examples, suggestions, considerations, and just some more information to help understand what each criterion looks like. And again, you have these links in the chat, and you can also find these from our State Seal of Civic Engagement webpage. I'm pretty happy about our frequently asked questions webpage. It currently has over 40 questions that we have broken down into different categories. Student eligibility, insignia procedures, local programming, connections to other award opportunities. Chances are If you have a question, you'll probably be able to find it or something similar to it on this page. I'm sure I just jinxed myself by saying that out loud, and I'll get a lot of questions that are nowhere near available on that page, but that's fine. If you have questions, please submit them to me. We actually built this web page using the questions that we got from our stakeholders throughout the state while we were developing the state seal. We have also turned in another update to this page. There will be about 5 more questions that came up during the most recent insignia request process. There's a wealth of information there for you if you ever need anything. That's a great place to start. And I'll highlight our insignia request form. It is available year round, so you can technically request insignias year round, although of course the majority are coming in the spring. It's a pretty straightforward form. You submit your contact information, you do indicate the number of insignias that you are requesting, and we do ask that you break that down based on how many you think will go on diplomas, how many you think will go on transcripts, how many you think will go on GEDs or certificates of completion. And then there's that certifying signature at the end where you certify that everything is in line with the statewide criteria. You click submit, and then I go into the office and I mail you your insignias. We do have another web page that has resources just for general civic engagement and civic learning. So there's all kinds of stuff you can find on this web page. We have them broken down based on distance learning resources, foundational resources that would include research and reports related to civic engagement, comprehensive resources. So these are your one-stop shops for everything you might need for civic engagement, databases of lessons, documents that can serve as a call to action, research and reports, testimonials, for training or institutes, etc. Our targeted tab breaks down these resources based on grade level, but also based on the 6 proven practices. So that can be pretty handy if you're trying to find something specific to current events or simulations and governance, etc. And then finally, tabs for students. That includes forums that students might find useful in civic engagement projects, connections to student institutes and student awards, and then educators. So professional development, professional learning opportunities, teacher institutes, anything you might need as an educator to really get more into civic engagement and civic learning. So many of those resources are now being transferred over to another resource I have to share, and this is the California Educators Together platform. If you subscribe to the superintendent announcements, you may have already heard about this. It was just recently announced by the superintendent. It's this new collaborative resource sharing platform where people from the CDE, but also stakeholders, all of you can sign up and you can upload and create and share and collaborate through this platform. We do have a state seal of civic engagement group on that platform. We are adding resources to it almost every day. I have several collections available through that group. And I really want to highlight, we have collections of toolkits and roadmaps available through this webpage as well. So a couple of our stakeholders, Monterey County, Los Angeles County, the Authentic Preparation Today work group, I think the Region 6 group also, they've created really amazing toolkits and roadmaps to help support local implementation. The Los Angeles County webpage has some videos. So if you would like a recorded version of this presentation I'm giving now, you can access those there. There's information about requesting insignias. So all of this is available through the California Educators Together platform. And there's a link if you would like to access that as well that I shared. You just have to create a free account with your email to get access to it. And I should mention, I'm betting that there are people here today who are also following literacy updates throughout the state, maybe the Comprehensive Literacy State Development Grant, the State Literacy Plan. There are also groups to support different literacy opportunities throughout the state that you can sign up for. They have a literacy resources repository and a state literacy plan toolkit that are available through this webpage as well. Some of you may be familiar with the CLICK project. They have worked over the past 3 years to provide statewide support for implementing the history social science framework. They have also created a webpage for the State Seal of Civic Engagement, which they're going to be building out over time. You also may be able to check in with your regional lead. They have a list of regional leads that you can contact to be put in touch with other individuals or get more information for the State Seal. And then finally, again, you have these links in the chat. I want to highlight the last 3. I do recommend if you have 10 minutes, you may want to check out the state board discussion of the State Seal criteria. That's available. That would be from the September meeting. And it's really a good way to kind of wrap your mind around what the state board was thinking with this criteria, how important accessibility was, and how that really is kind of underpinning of this opportunity. And like I mentioned, it's only about 10 minutes. And there's 2 other statewide civic awards that you may want to check out. There's the Civic Learning Awards that's sponsored by an initiative, a partnership between the state superintendent and the California Chief Justice. So they provide awards to schools that have demonstrated exceptional civic learning, but also individual champions of civics. And then there's the California Democracy Schools program out of Los Angeles County. I bring these up because we're finding that a lot of the schools that are offering, or districts that are offering, the state seal, they're using their actions with the Civic Learning Awards and the Democracy Schools to really help kind of pull everything together and work towards all three of these different opportunities. Last but not least, I want to highlight our History Social Science newsletter. This goes out quarterly, and so we publish updates about not just the state seal, but we have legislative updates, financial literacy updates, a literacy update, and all kinds of different resources and professional development opportunities coming up throughout the year. So if you'd like to join, you can just send a blank email to that address. I'm getting ready to publish our next one in a couple weeks. And we also publish updates through our History Social Science Twitter account. I think that is it. Thank you again so much for sharing your time with me. I'm so happy to be here. We also have a state seal dedicated inbox, but that also goes to me. So if you email that or you email me, I will be happy to help with any questions that come up after this. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was really helpful and such a nice way to kind of wrap our session up today and really dig into a lot of the important information around the seal. We have about 5 minutes for discussion, then we're going to just do a couple minutes of next steps and wrap up. Feel free to add a question to the chat or come off mute if there's anything you'd like to ask.
A question we got is, can we get your awesome slideshow, Sarah?
Sure. Yeah, of course. I can send it to Erica if that would be easiest.
Yeah, and we can add it to the website for the Institute. So we'll put it under session 1, so you can find it there. We'll do it right after this.
I have a question. Sarah, could you share which districts are really up and running with their state seal programs so we could kind of reference them or even kind of look at their model?
That's a great question. So the answer is yes, if you give me one moment. I will recommend that you also check out the Los Angeles County State Seal Collaborative webpage. I'll put a link to that in the chat in just a moment. So they're kind of gathering and publishing examples of state or of local criteria that's been developed, as well as board resolutions and other templates. They've been kind of posting those on their webpage. In terms of districts that have really been active, so I'm looking at my insignia request form right now. Anaheim Union High School District, highly engaged in civics for a long time, but they really had a program up and running pretty quickly, and I know they're happy to share information. Santa Barbara Unified School District had a pretty robust program as well. Irvine Unified School District, the Hayward Unified School District, and Riverside also. I don't want to leave Riverside out. Riverside Unified School District was one of the first requests that we received.
And we're going to hear from them in our next session as well in detail.
Yes, and Alvord, Amanda, I know I sent you some insignias, so it's nice to see you here.
That's awesome to hear Riverside County representing too. Sarah, thank you so much. I'm seeing lots of snaps and claps for you and thank yous in the chat. We so appreciate it. Thank you so much.